we are back, and we are reading more poetry submitted by you. Maybe not you, but submitted by my viewers. If you want the poetry we're reading to potentially be you, you can click on the link in the description to submit poetry to me. And this is the second video installment of me doing such things. Of course, I've read hundreds of poems submitted by people on my live streams, but the YouTube format is what is new. And today I will be reading two poems. One is a sonnet and one is a villanelle. So both traditional forms of poetry, which is really exciting because I think there's a lot to say about form itself and talk about that and how we play with it and how we bend those rules. So I'm very excited to dive into those two poems. And I don't think I'll waste any more words or time, and we'll just dive straight into the first poem, which is the sonnet. So here's our sonnet, the first poem we will be reading today, and it has been submitted anonymously. So we will just be looking at the poem itself. There have been no other questions or things that this person might want critique on. So we just get to talk about this poem in a very pure, sort of objective, analytic sense, just looking at the text without any particular biases or influences from the author, which is often my favorite way to look at a piece of poetry. I think the author and their intentions, we can get caught up in those as readers, and that can distract us from reading our own interpretations. So we're going to dive right in and read the poem. The words they use are never all they mean. Sometimes words dropped and left unsaid are key. Remain alert, read faces quick, ear keen, or they will know that you cannot just see. Why millions never need to try to know that when he said this, he meant otherwise, or when they said a yes but meant a no. It's tiring, each occasion, each surprise. Despite the nonsense, I know I must try. Around me, people know how to exist, and I just need to practice to get by, and I can trick them. Each chat they insist. Enough, enough, enough. I need a break. And now they know that you're a freak. So that's our sonnet. And to go over the idea of the sonnet form itself, I think is useful. So a sonnet is always, generally, unless we're breaking the rules, going to have 14 lines. And each of these lines are going to be 10 syllables. There are going to be rhymes at the end of our lines. There are different patterns of rhymes we can have depending on the kind of sonnet we are trying to write. In this case, right, the rhyming is happening on alternating lines. So we have mean and keen, right? We have key and see. And then we start over no and no, otherwise and surprise. And then we get try and by. And finally, exist and insist. And then at the end, in this case of the English sonnet, we have two lines that would rhyme with each other. Now, something cool that this work does is instead of having them rhyme, we have two words that look like they should rhyme with this EAK of break and freak, but they actually don't, right? I need a break, and now they know that you're a freak, right? And you'd expect some word, if you know the form of a sonnet, that's going to rhyme with break. So this is a breaking of the rules, right? Funny, since we have break here. And that's okay, right? Breaking the rules and playing with these things isn't always a bad thing, and it's often a very good thing to do, right? It shows that we can take a form and we can use its rules and then adjust them and tweak them in our own way to like make the kind of artistic statement we want. And I think in this case, right, the line that breaks these rules is, and now they know that you're a freak, right? So a freak, right? Someone who breaks the rules, someone who doesn't sort of align with the expectations of society. And I think that's such an excellent way to end a poem like this. Because, right, this poem seems to be about all of the rules and unspoken social things that we have to abide by in conversations and interacting with other people, right? Remain alert, read faces quick, ear keen, or they will know that you cannot just see why millions never need to try to know that when he said this, he meant otherwise. So this idea of these societal, social, linguistic rules that we can say something and mean something else, or imply something, right? We can say yes but mean no. And I think the author is quite fed up with this, right? We're describing this as nonsense, right? Despite the nonsense, I know I must try. Around me, people know how to exist, and I just need to practice to get by. So there's some unfamiliarity, right, with these rules, these social rules, and these implicit things. So this person needs to practice, they need to try to trick them to fit in. But, of course, as we get to the end, as we get to sort of the twist of the sonnet, which this is something that often happens in the sonnet, is these last two lines twist in some way and change direction. We get this, enough, 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 I need a break, right? All of this, all of these conventions, rules, unspoken rules, things that the author or the speaker in this poem doesn't really understand, just become too much. They become too tiring, too much to keep up with and to handle. And so we sort of break. And shouting, enough, 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 repeated. It's quite the impactful kind of moment in this poem. And then you break, right? I need a break. We break in this way. And then we've sort of failed, right? And now they know that you're a freak. And in that, we sort of leave behind the rules of the sonnet and the structures that are expected of us, which is such a lovely poetic thing to do here, and kind of do our own freaky thing, right? So I guess I started talking about rhymes and we got a little distracted from the sonnet itself, but I think this is an example, right? And this is something that is very useful to think about as a writer, as a poet, that the forms that we use, in this case the sonnet, can interact with and actually involve themselves with the meaning that we are trying to present in our poem, right? And when we break the rules of the form at the same time as we break the rules of society in terms of the meaning of the poem, we get this really nice effect where those things are working together. And I just think that's really well done and a great kind of poetic choice. Now we can look at the other rules, right? Rules, so to speak, of a sonnet. And one of them is our 10-syllable lines, and specifically to have 10 syllables in what is called iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter. Now, I'm sure many people have maybe like heard about this in high school or college classes, or earlier or later, and I think it is this kind of dreaded thing, the sonnet and the rhyme scheme and the syllables and all of that. But iambic pentameter is basically two things. I mean, there are two words. Iambic. This means that each word is taking on a certain rhythm called an iamb. And what that is is to do with syllables, the way that we move from one syllable to the next across the line of the poem. And the first syllable is going to be what we call unstressed. And then the second one is going to be stressed. And then we're going to repeat that one chunk called an iamb over and over again. And how many times are we going to do it? 5. Pentameter. Pentagon, 5 sides, 5 iambs in this case. So that's going to be a total, 2 times 5, of a, 10-syllable line. And the tricky part for a lot of people, and I do think it is hard, right? It's not an easy thing, is understanding this unstressed and stressed idea. And looking at this poem, I think we're just going to take a word from here, enough. So when we say the word enough, I invite anyone watching to actually say it out loud if you struggle with verse, enough. We have 2 syllables, right? And nuff. And when we say it, you can sort of feel the fact, it is very much a feel thing, that enough, is sort of, happens in passing. And the word really lands on nuff, right? If we were to think about it like musically or like a rhythm, right? Enough, da-dum, da-dum. So one is kind of light, comes up, and nuff comes down. That's the idea of unstressed and stressed, right? Now, these things always have a bit of leeway. Certain words it's hard to tell. Some things feel more or less stressed, and some things are also going to be stressed in certain ways in different contexts. And that's a really tricky thing about verse. Iambic pentameter is a kind of verse, writing with rhythm, is that these things are often a feel, they change based on the context, and there aren't really strict rules for how it works. It's very musical, it's very song-like, often kind of intuitive for people. So we can look at that in this poem, right? And I would say there are certain points in this where it is very strictly iambic pentameter. Enough, 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 I need a break. I need a break, right? I need, we land on need. A break, we hit break very heavily. So this line is, I think, like a very nice example of strictly written iambic pentameter. But not everything in this poem is, and that's also okay, right? So if we go from the start, the words they use are never all they mean. Sounds good, right? Has that the words they use are never all, but then never all, right? That's not exactly the same ba-dum, are never all, da-da-da-dum, right? They mean sometimes, right, is different. It's not that iambic feel. Sometimes words are dropped and left unsaid are key. Sometimes words dropped and left unsaid are key, right? So we're playing with this form and breaking it in certain spots, and not exactly always like following these strict rules. This could connect nicely, right? We could think about this again within the meaning of the poem as someone who is not quite, perfectly following the rules of society. And I think it works kind of nicely in this poem that we would not be following a strict form, because this person, this speaker, is very clearly struggling with these ideas throughout. But in general, it doesn't even always have to, be strict, even if it's not relating to the meaning of our poem. It's important, really, that the poem flows, and that it sounds good, and that we enjoy the writing and the reading of it. And if we get that, it doesn't really matter if we have something that breaks a form. Some people would argue with this. Some people are very strict about form. Some people might say that you should learn the strict form first and be very particular about it so you can break the rules later. I tend to be someone who thinks that, anything goes. And, people have been writing sonnets since, I don't even know, a long time. Certainly at least since Shakespeare, but I think there were people doing it before him. He just really mastered the sonnet. But we've been writing sonnets for hundreds of years. So to think that we still have to, write within these strict rules all the time and perfectly follow them is a bit silly, right? And sometimes people do that, and it can actually get in the way of their writing. Sometimes people will sit down to read or write a sonnet, and they will sound something like this, The words they use are never all they mean. Sometimes words dropped and left unsaid are key. And people will really try to force the feel of the verse and the sonnetness, the iambicness onto writing. That's something I think we should try to avoid, because it actually obscures the natural rhythm of the words. And I think for me, the ideal way to use verse is to have natural words that we can read out loud, as we would otherwise, and have it feel like there is a rhythm without us even trying, right? The words they use are never all they mean. There is some rhythm there, right? Da dun da dun da 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 dun dun dun. Sometimes words dropped and left unsaid are key. Remain alert, read faces quick, ear keen, or they will know that you cannot just see. Right? I'm not really forcing any rhythm onto these words, but there is a sort of dance happening within them. So that's like an overview of the sonnet form. And I'm fairly certain that this writer is kind of new to writing sonnets. So, but they probably know all these rules anyway. But it's good for anyone, it's good for everyone to explain it again. Now, in terms of practicing sonnets, and improving generally at writing verse, in a similar way to how I was describing them, I don't think the best way to practice sonnets is to drill the form into yourself and be I need to get my iambs just right and my rhymes just right. I often think if you want to write sonnets, and you want to do the forms that these other people have been writing for hundreds of years that are not very intuitive to the modern day, go read sonnets, right? Go read them, go feel them, go see how the verse naturally falls onto the words. And just do that a lot. It doesn't feel necessarily very easy at first, and oftentimes Shakespeare wrote in Old English, so it can be tricky to get the meanings as well, but it's good practice. And that way, you're reading and learning and reading, poetic history at the same time, while also improving this skill kind of naturally. But none of that really relates to this poem itself. And really what I care about doing here, of course, is analyzing the poem. It's good to have the context and the framework of the form, but the form is just that thing that we paint our poem on top of, our actual meaning, our actual words. And we've talked about some of them, some of this meaning, right? The idea that this feels like it's a poem about, social, maybe uncertainty, or feeling distanced from the conventions of the way people talk or interact, a sort of, lack of fluency in the way that people interact. And we can really dive into that line to line, right? The words they use are never all they mean, right? Is the first line of this poem. And what we're doing is we're dividing the world in this way. There is I and there is they. And when we create something like a they or an us or a we or a them, we always create another side. When we create an us, we create a them. So when we use they, I think it adds this, sort of social distance, this separation. There is they and there is me. And I don't understand. The words they use are never all they mean. So this really, really like almost sums up the idea of the whole poem in the first line. People are talking in ways that, you know, have all these implications and all these uncertainties surrounding them. Sometimes words dropped and left unsaid are key. And I like, I like this because there maybe is a sort of double meaning to the meaning here. Uh, because this all actually sounds a lot like poetry, right? Poetry is this place where we use words and they don't always mean what they mean. Sometimes words are dropped, right? The words dropped or left unsaid are key. Sometimes the things we don't say in a poem are as important as the words we do say, right? Now, that meaning sort of falls apart as we get into like reading faces and having a keen ear, though we can have a keen ear for sound and poetry. But remain alert. Read faces quick, ear keen. So there are all these things we have to do to like function in a social situation. We have to read faces and the cues of nonverbal things. We must have a keen ear for what's actually being said, being alert for all of these little things. Or they will know that you cannot just see. So here's where we get the sort of tension of this poem that comes back later, right? There's a constant threat. There's a constant threat of them not knowing that you, or that maybe the speaker, the I, because we say this sometimes, right? You to refer to sort of me or people in general, that you cannot just see, right? There's a threat. They'll know, I'll be found out that I'm socially incompetent, that I can't talk to people. I will say, I'm in this poem. I suffer all these thoughts for sure. These sort of anxieties, right? Or they will know that you cannot just see. Why millions never need to try to know. And this is kind of a fun line, right? We get this never need to try to know. Very like alliterative. And I think that just really nicely rolls off the tongue. Why millions never need to try to know. Never need to try to know. It sounds quite nice. I think this is like good verse writing and it's good poetic writing, right? This like to try to know. The need to try to know is kind of this fuzzy concept, but once we break it down, people don't have this need, or they are just naturally able to know what people are saying, whereas I need to try, I need to put an effort to decode these social signals. And millions, most people, they are functional and can understand that when he said this, he meant otherwise, right? They pick up on these alternate meanings of speech. Or when they said a yes, they meant a no. This idea of tone, saying that you'll do a thing, but saying it in a way that is really meant as a rejection somehow. Very difficult. It's tiring, right? It is. It's tiring, each occasion, each surprise. These surprises of intention, revealed later, right? When you're like wrong. Despite the nonsense, I know I must try. Around me, people know how to exist, and I just need to practice to get by. And so we create this very like existential idea, right? People know how to exist, right? As if existing, right? Because it does, existing in society depends on talking to people. It depends on being understood and communicating. And so if we don't do that, we become like fully socially isolated. So I must try. It's imperative. It gives this obligation to the poem. I have to do this thing, or else I will cease to exist. And I just need to practice to get by, and I can trick them each chat they insist. Right? So everyone's talking, everyone's trying to have these conversations, to have a chat, and If I practice, if I figure it out, I'll be able to. But then, kind of suddenly, out of nowhere, this poem boils over. Enough, 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 I need a break. Right? It just comes out of nowhere, right? This sort of, anxious breakdown. Perhaps, we could liken this to the feeling of like a panic attack, to become so overwhelmed by a social situation or some kind of interaction that one is just led to fully break down. A panic attack, just like an anxious, a fit of anxiety, right? When the anxiety comes in and just takes over. And so you snap. And then suddenly, right, our author is a crazy person. They're a freak. They broke down. They suffered. And now they know that you're a freak. Something really interesting about this poem. There is very, very little concrete imagery or symbols. Concrete imagery, right, is something we can sense. It is something we can see or touch. It's objects, it's tastes, it's sounds, actual like events and tactile things happening. Concrete, because it has substance. The alternative to concrete is abstract. And these are sort of things like thoughts, right? Thoughts and feelings and ideas and things that exist, not tethered to something I can hold in my hand, something I can touch. And this poem really lacks any of these concrete things, right? We don't have the people's mouths as they talk, nor their eyes as we look into them. We don't have, on each occasion, any of the details of those occasions. When we have the breakdown, right, we don't have any of the imagery of where the breaking down is happening. And I think, that's okay. One of these things is not necessarily better than the other, the concrete or the abstract. People will tell you a lot, to write with the 5 senses. And even I talked about it in the last video. And that can be useful sometimes. But the abstract can be really helpful too. Because when we have nothing concrete, we can imagine this poem really fully existing inside someone's head, which is perfect, right, for anxiety. It's perfect for racing thoughts. The words they use are never all they mean. Sometimes words dropped and left unsaid are key. Remain alert, read faces quick, ear keen, or they will know that you cannot just see. Right? We can think of all these rules that the speaker has made for themselves. Reminders in their head as they are actually in a conversation. Stay alert. Read their faces, right? Keep your ear keen. Remember that the words they're not saying can be useful. Remember that a yes can be a no. Remember that, you have to try, you have to do this, you have to exist. And then these become a sort of bombardment of reminders, of rules, of ideas that kind of keep washing over the speaker again and again and again and again until they just become too much to handle. And I think that's a really lovely use, right, of this difference between the concrete and the abstract. If we had something tactile, it might take away from that in-your-headedness. It might ground the poem. And that can be very useful for some poems, to be grounded in concrete things. But in this case, if we grounded it, it might feel less anxious. It might feel less in your own head. So in this case, right, abstraction is serving this poem, I think, in a really positive way. I'm going to read the whole poem again, just because I think as we analyze, as we try to understand something, it can be useful to zoom back out on the whole scale of the poem, sometimes we notice things that we haven't noticed before. And I might not notice anything more to talk about, and then I'll just be done with this one. But here's the poem again. The words they use are never all they mean. Sometimes words dropped and left unsaid are key. Remain alert, read faces quick, ear keen, or they will know that you cannot just see. Why millions never need to try to know that when he said this, he meant otherwise. Or when they said a yes but meant a no, it's tiring. Each occasion, each surprise. Despite the nonsense, I know I must try. Around me, people know how to exist, and I just need to practice to get by, and I can trick them. Each chat they insist. Enough, 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 I need a break, and now they know that you're a freak. Something cool here in the end, which I hadn't seen before, is it's enough, 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 I need a break. And now they know that you're a freak. Right, so we have this very first person almost dialogue. We can put it in quotation marks that I'm trying to write that you can't really see over all the colors. You can imagine this person literally, speaking that. And then, so it's in first person I. But then there's this you, as if there is some other that is addressing the speaker. And we see it before as well, right? We have it, or they will know that you cannot just see. So then I think that feels to me like the idea of, our sort of internal voice, right? That voice inside the head of this particularly anxious person, that internal monologue of these bad thoughts. Well, maybe not the bad thoughts, but the part that judges oneself and says, like, here's the things you need to do. Here are the rules, but also when we fail them, right, look at you. You're pathetic. You're a freak. You couldn't even, do the thing. You couldn't even keep your cool. And that's contrasted against the actual I, right? I must try. I need to practice. I can trick them if they insist, and then I need a break. So this creates almost two characters within the character of the actual speaker, and then also along with the character of them. This can be a really useful thing to do as we read poems, to think of our cast, as if it were a book or a TV show or a movie, right? Our cast of characters. So in this poem, we have you. Well, okay, let's try again. We have I as the person, and then we have the one who says you, right? A different perspective on I. And then we have they. We also technically have he, that when he said this, he meant otherwise. But that's pretty much just, someone within the they, right? The people who understand social situations. And just calling to a non-specific but, individual instance. So when we do this, when we identify our cast of characters, that there is an I, that there is someone saying you, that there is a they, we can learn more about the poem. We can understand it more deeply and get this feeling that, oh, right, if we interpret this as another voice, as another character, we get this added meaning to our interpretation, that there is a nagging voice inside the head, which aligns, quite nicely with our reading of the abstractness of this being thoughts in one's head. And then all of that is separate from the general they of society. I think that's most of what I have to say reading this poem. and analyzing it and digging into it, I'm sure there were more connections to be made, more, beautiful little sound things to be found, like this need to try to know. And, the longer we read, the more we can always find in a poem. The more that we keep, scribbling across this page, the more things we'll start to uncover. But, we also have to stop at some point and say, well, that's enough for now. I feel like I've enjoyed this poem enough for this moment. And, some might say, right, some might look at this and say, like, wow, this is like overanalyzing. This is finding things in a text that maybe the author never intended. Maybe they never intended to break the form here with the rhyme as to imply the breaking of the social standards of society. But when we do that, when we create these interpretations, what we're doing is giving ourselves something more beautiful as a reader, right? Bringing these ideas together, creating something more forceful with more connections, with more ideas that can carry, more emotions. And I don't think at that point, what the author intended is necessarily something that matters for the reader. Because I think the goal of a reader is to enjoy a poem as thoroughly as possible, right? If we're not going to sit down and enjoy the poem, then like why are we doing that, right? So here's so that's the result, of some amount of analysis of this poem. And I'll read it one more time, since I always like to read them again at the end. Good to zoom back out, right? We dig into all the ideas, and then we want to zoom out and just appreciate the feelings of the poem. Just speak it, just say it. And I think we'll find, if you go back and listen to my first reading of the poem, there will be less emotion. There will be less, of an intentional performance than this last one. Because the more we understand something and the more we feel it, the more we're going to want to speak it, perform it back to ourselves in a way that has feeling. So, here is my, concluding performance of this poem. The words they use are never all they mean. Sometimes words dropped and left unsaid are key. Remain alert. Read faces quick, ear keen, or they will know that you cannot just see. Why millions never need to try to know that when he said this, he meant otherwise, or when they said a yes but meant a no. It's tiring, each occasion, each surprise. Despite the nonsense, I know I must try. Around me, people know how to exist, and I just need to practice to get by, and I can trick them each chat that they insist. Enough, 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 I need a break. And now they know that you're a freak. So, that's the first of the poems submitted for this video. The lovely sonnet, submitted anonymously, but you know who you are. And I will thank you, the person who submitted this poem. I always read these with so much gratitude. I am very privileged to have people want to share their work with me, these little pieces of other people's worlds, right? It's a real treasure to be able to read. And so when we read, at least I think it is most right to read deeply, to understand, to analyze, to enjoy, so we can fully, exist in that world. So that's all for that poem. And now we'll move on to the next one, I suppose. No time to delay, although I will like cut and take a break and drink some water. But the next poem is a villanelle, which is another kind of form, entirely different from the sonnet. And it is called Storm Cloud Silver, and by an author who goes by the username of Furry Combat Wombat. And here it is. Storm Cloud Silver. Heed the elder of wonder, but yet you still have need. Feed the hungry child of thunder. When you keel from blunder, let wisdom take the lead. Heed the elder of wisdom. Wonder. When your sails are torn asunder, your appetite will bleed. Feed the hungry child of thunder. Don't dive 6 feet under. Stay afloat and keep your future freed. Heed the elder of wonder. Take the world's plunder. Inherit your gifted greed. Feed the hungry child of thunder. Your will. Actions unified, funder, conscience's single patron, and yet you. Plead. Heed the elder of wonder, feed the hungry child of thunder. Storm Cloud Silver, which is a villanelle, the form of this work. One very classic, very, well-loved and used form of poetry. And what I was marking here on the page as I went down, these little dashes, is pointing to I would say the most iconic and important part of the structure called the villanelle. And that is the refrain. And a refrain is just a repeated line, a whole line that gets repeated again throughout a poem. And that comes from, like song. When we sing, we can sing a refrain, and it's a return to something from before. So in the villanelle, we have 2 refrains, refrain 1 and refrain 2. And in the case of this poem, they are heed the elder of wonder, feed the hungry child of thunder. And it is always the case in a villanelle, at least by the traditional form, that the first and third lines of the first stanza, right, are going to be our refrains, 1 and then 2. And then as we go on into our next stanzas, we are going to end each of them alternating with the refrains, refrain 1, ending the next stanza, and then the following one will end with the refrain 2. We'll keep that pattern, right, ending with 1 and then ending with 2 another time. And then we'll close out the poem with our one and only 4-line stanza, which is going to have 2 new lines, and then our both refrains back to back. That is the core of the villanelle. Kind of the most important idea is these repeated things that happen over and over. And that repetition is actually where we get the name villanelle, because a villanelle oftentimes has this feeling of what a lot of people describe as like obsession or even raving over a single idea that we can't get out of our head. And when we keep repeating a line again and again, it has this way of, sticking in the head like it's something we can't escape. 2 very famous villanelles to go check out if you're not familiar with this form. The most famous is by Dylan Thomas, and it is called Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. And that one is about death, right? So this idea that we cannot get out of our head in that poem is death, and it keeps coming back, that going into that good night. And then another great villanelle, which I enjoy, is Mad Girl's Love Song. Mad Girl's Love Song by Sylvia Plath. And that one is literally kind of about going mad and an obsessed love that is very doomed and very tragic and very confessional. So this idea of the villain, of the return of an idea of an obsession, is really core to sort of the tradition of this form. Now, we don't always have to observe that. We can write a villanelle about anything, but it is always going to be the case that we are going to have an idea that sticks in our head with this 1-2, 1-2 going on throughout the stanzas. And another feature of this form, which this poem does very clearly, doesn't change anything from tradition, is the rhyme scheme. So a traditional villanelle has the refrains rhyme, wonder and thunder, and then as the first line of each following stanza, these new lines also rhyme with the refrains. Now, in between those lines, it sets up a new rhyme scheme: need, lead, bleed, freed, greed. And those things sort of play off of and contrast our original rhyme scheme of wonder and thunder, right? Something this poem does that is not part of the form, the traditional form of the villanelle, so we could call this an expansion, is having those rhymes also occur at the beginning of the refrains, right? We have heed and feed, which rhymes with need and lead, and creates kind of an interlocking rhyme scheme here, which is really cool throughout this poem, that these middle lines kind of connect back to the refrain as well. That is not one of our sort of like required or traditional things, so I think it's a really cool innovation though, and it does a lot for the sound of this poem. And sometimes villanelles have a consistent syllable count for lines. This villanelle does not do that, right? We have very short lines: don't dive 6 feet under, 6 syllables. And then we have conscious is single patron and yet you plead, which is like, I don't know, like 11 syllables or something. I'm not going to count. So we're not observing, that thing that often happens in the villanelle. And that's okay, right? We can use this form as we please and as we wish to better communicate our ideas. That's always the goal. So, now that we have that out of the way, the sort of overview of the villanelle, because it is one of our sort of less common forms, we ask the question of, what is this poem actually about? And I love analyzing villanelles. I love reading them because they really give you a foot in the door as an approach of how to read them, right? Since they have such a central idea, the refrains, wonder and thunder, usually the case is that if you can understand those and what they are saying, it kind of lets you unlock the puzzle of the poem and really understand, through those main ideas, what this storm cloud silver is really talking about. So we can start with heed the elder of wonder. And so to heed, right, is usually to listen to, or to respect, or to respond to. We can heed a call, and that is to, respond to that call. And that which we are heeding is the elder of wonder, which we capitalize as sort of a very proper, we'll say, character in this poem, so to speak, right? Elder and wonder. We do the same with hungry child of thunder, and even a few other things later, right? Wisdom, down at the bottom, action, right, is another one of these capitalized words. But that's, getting a bit off the point. I think it's interesting that we're picking these things out is important, and that could help us understand this later. But first, we just want to understand the meaning of the refrain. So an elder of wonder, right? Something old, right? And wonder, probably, something that is maybe observant and appreciates the world, is maybe reflective. That feels very associated with, an elder, an old person. And that is very different. That is very contrasted against our hungry child of thunder, right? So rather than a listener and observant thing, something heeding and wondering, We have feed, we have something consumptive, and it is hungry, and it is a child, and it is loud, right? Thunder is loud, the child is maybe impulsive. We saw the word, action earlier, and the child maybe acts, right, in a very strong, forward way. And these things, that's really cool, I think, how those things play off of each other. It's not always the case in a villanelle that they're sort of counterpoints to each other. In the case of, for example, Dylan Thomas's Do Not Go Gentle, his lines, his refrains are do not go gentle into that good night. And then the other one is rage, rage against the dying of the light. So they kind of build on each other, right? One is to not, accept death, and then one is to fight against death, right? Whereas these are sort of opposites, to heed the elder of wonder and to feed the hungry child of thunder. A back and forth, maybe in whoever it is that is heeding or feeding these things. We still don't really know what they are, though. And we can understand that, I think, through the rest of the poem, probably, and through the relation to each other, right? We heed and we feed one, but if we read it going down the page, heed the elder of wonder, but yet you still have need. So to just do this first thing, to just take the first advice of heeding this, is not enough. You still have need. You're still lacking something, and so feed the hungry child of thunder. So it seems that in the first stanza we're establishing a dichotomy, but a dichotomy of two things that we have to maybe keep in coexistence, right? We need both of them in some way. Now, we start to learn about them as we go on. When you keel from a blunder, let wisdom take the lead, heed the elder of wonder. So, when you make a mistake, right, when you run into some trouble and have a problem and you fall down, when you keel, sort of keel over from a mistake, you're in pain, let wisdom take the lead. Heed the elder of wonder. So the elder of wonder is in some way connected to wisdom, right? Maybe this idea of reflection, of knowledge, of patience, all of these things associated with the idea, of course, of like the archetypal elder, someone who is wise and knowing and patient. Wisdom. And so, when do we call this thing into action? When we keel from a blunder, right? When we are in some way down and hurt. So it seems that maybe this is like an aspect of our mind, right, that we use in a certain situation. Now, how is that different from the child, right? When your sails are torn asunder, your appetite will bleed. Feed the hungry child of thunder. So it's interesting because we have another sort of, adversarial moment when we're similar to the keeling from the blunder, right? When the sails are torn asunder, when we are hurt in some way, when we are down and damaged and suffering, we would call on the hungry child of thunder. But in this case, we don't call the elder. And I think that's interesting. And I think maybe that comes from the difference of sails being torn and like keeling from a blunder. So a blunder, right, is a mistake that you make. It's sort of self-imposed. And then when your sails are torn asunder, it's sort of external, right? And when we make a mistake, we probably don't want to like lash out and act and be impulsive. We maybe want to reflect on what we've done wrong so we can do better next time. And when we are maybe hurt by something external, like a storm, I guess, to call back to our title, Storm Cloud Silver, when we're hurt by a storm, right, we need to act, we need to do something. There's an external threat, And so we need the child of thunder, that hunger to push us forward. That seems to be the difference between the two. And then to me, this seems to be a poem about like aspects of our mind, right? That there is one side of us that's very impulsive and rash, and there's one part that's reflective and slow. And we use them in these different situations. Next, right? Don't dive 6 feet under. Stay afloat and keep your future freed. Heed the elder of wonder. So we have another threat, right? Another threat to our mind, and that is diving 6 feet under. 6 feet under, is the idea of a grave. And if we are diving in, that sounds like, ending one's own life, right? To dive into death. And that maybe is aided by, right, stay afloat and keep your future freed. If you die, your future is shackled. You have no future. And so you stay afloat, keep your head above the water, right? And heed the elder of wonder. So it is that reflection and that patience, and maybe wonder as like a slow appreciation for beauty, or for like the slow, lovely, patient things in life. And also just to not act rash, right? If you act rashly when you're thinking about diving 6 feet under, well, you'll just jump. And at that time, that's not maybe the frame of mind that is helpful. Another thing I notice now that we're setting up in this poem is like a nautical connection, right? We have keel, which is, a part of a boat, I think. I think boats have keels, or it's some part, or a boat can keel. I'm not sure. And we have sails, and we have 6 feet under and diving and staying afloat. So we're creating this imagery, subtly and slowly building up the idea that we are like on a ship on the water. We are floating along, and there are a number of threats that can appear to us on this voyage. And that's very topical. I've been hearing a lot about the Odyssey because the movie is coming out, or it just came out like yesterday or something. But anyway, then we move on, right? Take the world's plunder, kind of piratey, right? To plunder something, so that fits with our nautical theme. Inherit your gifted greed, feed the hungry child of thunder. So then we have another situation that calls for the child, right? When we need to act, when we need to take, we need to have, I guess, a little bit of greed, a little bit of action in life, some motivation, some desire, some thunder to do things, right? And the elder of wonder, who's just reflective and calm and peaceful, maybe isn't ready to like snatch opportunity when it presents itself to us. So we also need the child, the hunger, the drive. And that acts as, another facet of these playing off of each other. I like how we set up the pattern of bad thing when you keel, bad thing when your sails are torn, bad thing don't dive 6 feet under. And then we sort of subvert our pattern with taking the world's plunder. It lifts the poem a bit, right? And keeps some energy to push us into the end, which is your will, actions unified thunder. So again, we're talking about these, aspects of the mind and these parts of self. Your will, actions unified thunder, conscience's single patron. Really connects with the idea of wealth, right? Funder, someone who funds, is a patron, and we have plunder and greed. Conscience's single patron, and yet you plead. So this punctuation does a really cool thing here, where I think it gives at least 2 meanings that we can read in this line. Your will, actions unified funder, conscience's single patron, and yet you. Right? So you are your will. You are the unifying of your conscience. It is the ability to, like, I guess, act and reflect, to push and drive and hunger, and to slow down and be patient and consider. And I think unified here, right, points to that, this idea that you are not just the elder of wonder. You are both the elder and the child. You're not just the child, you are both of these things. And that can maybe help us get through, I guess, the voyage that is life, the journey that is our path on earth, our odyssey, if we are Odysseus. But there is also, right, your will, actions unified funder, conscious is single patron, and yet you plead. And yet you plead, heed this thing, feed this thing. So even though we, like, have both of them, right, and unity can drive us forward, we still find ourselves pleading and going back and forth, trusting the elder and then flipping to the child, and maybe not having a perfect command, right, over our life. There's still some tumultuous rocking on the ship, I suppose. And that's such a cool way to describe the mind, right, as these two different parts that are kind of both things you might listen to on the voyage of life. And I think the metaphors, or even the symbols, just the imagery in general, works really well and very consistently, right? So our poem, Storm Cloud Silver, right, has this, like, water idea, and and I guess, so storm cloud silver, right? This is like a silver lining, right? That's the saying, every storm cloud has a silver lining or whatever. So then it's about, right, finding positive things in the dark, right? And maybe there's also that there's darkness alongside positive things. So then even when we blunder and are hurt and struggle, we are able to find the positive through these, like, guiding things in our mind. And then this poem, maybe this poem is about, a great struggle, a great storm cloud, a rainy day. We could think of it as being something like grief or depression, or any sort of just struggle. I think it is vague enough that it doesn't point to any in particular, and we can kind of insert that into the poem, right? There's, like, the dive 6 feet under, which might be depression, right? Or the tails torn asunder, which is some external suffering. Blunder, just our own inability. And maybe it just speaks then to struggle in general. And water works really well with struggle, right? Water and this nautical theme, because water, right, throughout literature often has this association with, like, sadness and stuff. I mean, water is tears, right? Water is the rainy day, right? The blues. It is the storm. It is, for our Odysseus character, it is a great voyage that we must travel. It's very difficult. It can be, like, murky and dark and scary. It can be chaotic and powerful, right? Something we cannot beat. It can also be, reflective, right? As a symbol, we think of our other Greek myth of Narcissus, right? Looking into the water. And so it works very well on a lot of levels, that our sort of storm cloud-filled voyage would be one of human struggle and human difficulty. And I think even that's probably why it works quite well for the Odyssey, right? That this poem is a sort of little odyssey of its own. And I also think we have this idea of, like, wealth in here, which is another through line, right? We have your future freed, this like action and possibility. And then we have plunder, and we have gifted greed, and we even have funder and patron. There's a double meaning in like your will, which comes after gifted greed, right? Your will as, something left, money left to a descendant. So then, right, you have this idea of taking and filling up your life with like things and having and need, right? There is need in our first stanza, yet you still have need. And that's very interesting, right? That's very interesting how we use money in relation to all of this, taking the world's plunder, inheriting your greed. And I think that is very reflective of action, right? Your will, actions unifying plunder, right? In this world, it is so often that acting, right, gives us, profit and success. But even wealth can just be a symbol of, victory, right? To come back with great wealth from our voyage. And perhaps that's an aspect of this poem, that we are going to go off in the sea of doubt and danger and life, and maybe just following the elder of wonder, the wise part of our mind, will keep us alive and keep us okay. It will keep us from making mistakes and keep us from, ending ourselves and diving into the water. But that's not life, right? Then you just come back from the voyage, with nothing new. So then you have the hunger, right? The child that wants new things and wants to take and wants to return from our journey with something greater, something more, that human impulse to build and create and act. I think that's lovely. We could also think of this poem, the imagery being that of sort of our age of exploration, Christopher Columbus or Amerigo Vespucci, or the guy who circumnavigated the globe, who got sent off, right, into the dangers of the sea to, explore and face trials and, unfortunately, plunder, right? They were, kind of doing some shitty stuff at the end. But, they had patrons and funders, right? And they had greed, and they struggled throughout. So we could use that imagery as well as maybe like the Odysseus to frame a poem like this. And maybe that casts a slightly more negative tone onto the child of hunger, right? That which takes and eats from others. But at the same time, I think there is that very human kind of selfish impulse which we cannot entirely purge, no matter how hard we try, right? Heed the elder of wonder, but, you still have need. You will always still have need. And I think that's an interesting thing to include in a poem like this, right? In a poem that might be about struggle and suffering or depression and grief, is that selfishness, right? There's an aspect of selfishness that helps us like get through life. I think that's very cool. I like in general how vague this poem is, while being very specific in its imagery, right? It's talking about this specific, sort of journey and the sails and the keel and the plunder and the greed and these characters, right? But they all point to a bunch of like vague ideas which we can interpret in a number of ways, which I think is really lovely, a lovely thing to do for some readers. Not everyone has to like poems like this or likes poems like this, but we can exist on a scale in poetry between vagueness, right, which is maybe the possibility for many interpretations, and specificity, right, where we are talking about specific. This is a hard word. Specificity, which is, having like one message and one idea that we're trying to communicate. And there's like not much else in terms of like interpretive space. And this poem, I think, does a really good job of showing like the merits of vagueness. That many people could read Storm Cloud Silver and apply that idea of like going through a general struggle to their specific circumstance and thinking about their own hungry child of thunder, however that voice sounds in their head, and their own, right, elder of wonder, and applying those to the situation of their life. You know, maybe they feel that, oh, right now I need to listen to that elder of wonder. So I think that's a really powerful poem about struggle. And it does an interesting thing to bring it back to the beginning of the idea of villanelle, right? Which we talked about having this obsession. And we can ask, what is that obsession in this poem? What are we obsessed with? Well, it's that balance, right, between the elder of wonder and the hungry child of thunder. But these two things fundamentally are an obsession with living, right? And trying to find a balance between those things that get us through the storm. And I think that really points to this like heroic character, that we are, like Odysseus in the Odyssey, where we must continue living against all these adverse things and keep fighting through, the trials of life that we all have, whatever they are. And we do so, right? And maybe there is a fundamental humanness in this sort of obsession to live. Maybe just life, right, has an obsession with living, animals and plants to create and to reproduce. And so maybe it just says something very truthful about the underlying nature of being a person. At least that's what it says to me. And of course, this analysis, is mine, and it's my reading and for the other one, right? And everyone can and should, right, read this poem in their own way. Maybe I should have said it at the start, like before I started. I should give like a disclaimer, like read the poems before hearing my thing and get your own opinions and thoughts. If anyone did that, that would make me very happy. Yeah, but, these are just my thoughts. This is just my way of reading, and I think any of this can probably be read very differently, and that's entirely valid too. But that's like the extent of my thoughts at this time. So, thank you so much for submitting this poem, Furry Combat Wombat. A joy to read, really. And here is another time, a final time, Stormcloud Silver. Heed the elder of wonder, but yet you still have need. Feed the hungry child of thunder. When you keel from a blunder, let wisdom take the lead. Heed the elder of wonder. When your sails are torn asunder, your appetite will bleed. Feed the hungry child of thunder. Don't dive 6 feet under. Stay afloat and keep your future freed. Heed the elder of wonder. Take the world's plunder. Inherit your gifted greed. Feed the hungry child of thunder. Your will, actions, unified funder. Conscience's single patron, and yet you. Plead. Heed the elder of wonder. Feed the hungry child of thunder. Stormcloud Silver by Furry Combat Wombat. It was such a joy to read both of these poems today, and I think both of them are excellent, illustrations of how we can use form in our writing and how we can advance form or kind of play with form as a way to express ourselves and our ideas more deeply. So so many thanks for submissions. And if anyone watching, right, wants to submit poetry and have me read it just the same as I read these, there is a Google form in the description of the video, which you can click on and you can put your poem and I'll read it. and that's really it. I absolutely cannot wait until the next video once I have enough to make another one of these, and I'll see you then, I guess. Bye.